Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo, for quite a detailed, comprehensive elaboration on the relation between the COVID-19 threat and situation to our economy generally. And definitely several of your recommendations and concerns on certain industries affected has also resonated into some new questions with in the Q&A. There's been quite active comments and questions, over almost 20 questions now. I will go through perhaps select certain questions that we can start first. And as you ended up your talk earlier, looking into specific industries affected, I'll start with one question here, which focuses on the small and medium enterprises. So I'll just read through the question here. Recently, we heard from market where some large corporations stop supporting or award projects to the SMEs as they worry that SME can't survive in the long run due to COVID-19. They prefer to award to MNCs, multinational corporations, or foreign companies where they have much stronger financial condition. So this question is whether this situation of the new normal post-COVID-19 would bring this negative effect towards the SME, and whether it is this condition could be something morally or economically right, ethically right. Should the government, if such situations happen, take some actions to regulate and to protect the SMEs and smaller businesses?
Yes, well, I think the fact of the matter is that we live in what you described as a capitalist economy. You can't tell firms what to do. If the firms wants to source from a particular supplier rather than another supplier, you cannot order them to do what they. I mean, Japan is doing that by trying to get the Japanese firms to leave China, to come back to Japan, and so on. Basically, this is a reflection of the economic war, the tensions between those countries. And similar problems are also happening between Japan and South Korea, and the South Koreans are not very happy about it. And that's why that's the only reason why Japanese have to go through quarantines when they visit Korea now. But this is a problem. This is a problem that you have preferences by firms all the time, and this problem is going to get much worse right now. And even the person who raised the question raised a particular question, but this problem is rife. You have people who've seen, force majeure clauses in their contracts being invoked to say that, the contract is now, our orders are cancelled now because of force majeure. You most of the time when you sign a contract, you never look at all the small print. Okay, and a good lawyer would normally, protect their bosses by providing all those clauses. And so you have a great deal of discrimination which is taking place. The problems of SMEs, what the questioner raised is one of the problems. There are many other problems they are facing, including some of the other problems I mentioned earlier. But SMEs make up, they make up over 97% of the enterprises in this country, and that doesn't even include the family businesses, which are run often without much licensing or registration. Okay, so we are talking about the vast majority of people in this country. But do you see them having much of a voice at the table? You often have one or two so-called exemplary SMEs, usually somebody who's got a advanced degree in engineering or something like that, running a small enterprise. But the ordinary SMEs, which are not so sophisticated and so on and so forth, they are facing incredible numbers of incredible problems, and life has not been made easier for them by any means by various government policies over the years. I'll give you a simple example, which has got nothing to do with the question, but I think it's very telling. We had jihad memerangi orang tengah. Okay, it was so successful that in Kelantan, 21 perai who were these are middlemen, 21 perai, the 21 perai who were registered have all been eliminated. So you've eliminated the middlemen. Who were these perai? They were Malays. Okay, so when this is supposedly one of the Malay first policies. Okay, there is a very little understanding that the nature of our society has changed. You could associate the middleman with ethnic Chinese, say 50, 60 years ago, but the country has changed. So people are living in their old mindsets. And to play games by, ethnic games and so on and so forth, today, when we are dealing with 21st century problems, is really, unfortunately, a step backwards. But part of the reason the SMEs are often ignored is because many of the SMEs are seen to be associated with a particular ethnic group and so on and so forth. And they really don't have much of a place at the table. The so-called organizations which have been set up for the SMEs rarely address their problems. Talk to any SMEs, enterprises on their own and ask them how much support they get from the government, even in good times, let alone in these extraordinary times which your questionnaire refers to.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Chomo. I'll move to the next question. This question is by Chung Ni Kar. It's a question regarding on the focus on global versus local economy. Generally, the past 2 or 3 decades, the booming of the globalization and also online economy, and at the current time now, we could see that international relations and trade and also the sense of globalization as tend to be not as before. And so the question I think points on whether now is the time for us to focus local rather than global as the practice of the past decades. What is your view on that?
Well, I think one has to recognize 2 things. One is that the Malaysian economy has been an open economy since the colonial times. And in the post-colonial period, for more than 6 decades, the authorities have perpetuated that. And so the fate of the Malaysian economy is very much intertwined with the fate of the global economy. And we cannot run away from that. What we must begin to think about, and this is the challenge posed by your questioner's question, what we need to begin to think about is how do we strategically disengage so that we are far more self-reliant in areas that count. And that's why I highlighted those 3 areas of the supply chains, where I think there is going to be an inevitable, when Vietnam said that they are not committed to all the rice exports beyond their contracts. Everybody who's been importing rice from Vietnam must have, begins to think twice. And so I think what we see is that particularly in those 3 areas, food, energy, and medical products, we are going to see some transitions, which might be seen by many people as not being economically sensible. But realistically speaking, I think it is important for us to begin to see what can be done viably. I don't think we should pour a lot of money into trying to develop, to have cows which in air conditioned things, so to produce more milk, for example. We can find other sources of calcium and protein rather than cow's milk. But so I think we have to think very pragmatically, But the high level of subsidies which we have right now for rice, for example, should be reconsidered. Some rice should continue to be grown in this country, but we should begin to think much more about thinking much more about consuming much more vegetables, much more fruit, local fruits and vegetables. Why, for example, are we consuming so many imported fruits? Are we beginning to think about, about improving our animal breeding methods, poultry breeding, fish breeding, and so on and so forth. All these things need to be thought about, but it's not a question of simply making an economic decision. You need to consult with people from the Ministry of Agriculture. You need to consult with farmers. And the success story of countries which have been able to take effective early measures is precisely by involving their populations. If you look at Kerala, it's a small state in southwestern India, but what they do with a population larger than Malaysia's, but what they do is that they keep the people fully informed, keep the people fully advised of the situation, and organize sessions to get feedback from them. Nobody's opinion is too low to count. We need to have a very different kind of attitude towards life. That we begin to respect the opinions of everybody, not just the rich and powerful. And this, I think, is a very important transition we should make. So coming back to the question, my answer is very simply that we need to begin to do that, but we need to do it. We cannot do it abruptly. We have to do it gradually and very pragmatically. We can't start doing things which are completely unsustainable. We need to begin to think of transitions which are possible. I think, for example, that we should be involved in far more production of medicines, of generic medicines. There's hardly any research, for example, about a lot of tropical diseases. We are hardly involved. A very poor country like Cuba, there's much, much more research on tropical medical problems than we do. And so we need to rethink our priorities. And in that context, we need to encourage, on a very selective and targeted basis, the transitions in some of those areas. But he's right, or she's right. There is going to be a transition towards shorter supply chains. And unless we recognize that and make the necessary accommodations, don't wait until we are kicked out of a supply chain and then we start thinking about what we're going to do. We can anticipate that is going to happen.
Thank you, Prof. Jomo. Okay, I'm looking at the question list again. The next question on the list is regards to agriculture and food. I think Prof. Jomo have already touched about food and agriculture quite significantly. I'll touch more on this. There's quite a number of questions which asks mainly about situations of inequality among people in the society, and also something which is related, I think, the sustainability of jobs. I think there's quite a number of articles are being reported, including by international labor organizations, that it is almost quite certain that the situation of employment and availability of job is one of the most important concerns on regards to the economic situation and what should be the focus on reviving the economy. Perhaps Prof. Jomo have some comments or response on that.
Yes, I think we've been lucky to have close to full employment for about 3 decades now, since the 1990s, and this is probably going to be a thing of the past in the near future, and possibly in the medium term as well. And this is going to be a very difficult transition. The 2 groups which are going to be most affected are the ones I mentioned earlier, the daily rated workers, as well as the petty businesses, which are not going to be able to survive, many of whom are not going to be able to survive this lockdown. What we have seen is, to mix metaphors, a lockdown in wrestling is going to deliver a knockout in boxing. and we're going to have an economic knockout, unfortunately. So, this is very, very serious and very grim for such people. But, I think it is important to look at ILO figures. But ILO figures, let's face it, any international organization depends on national numbers. If we do not produce the numbers, we do not feed the FAO, for example, with good agricultural statistics, it's rubbish in, rubbish out. So what we need to do, and I think the Department of Statistics has recently been very, very good in terms of doing a lot of innovative things. What we need is a good understanding of what is happening. And we are going to get it by looking at our Department of Statistics numbers, as well as other statistics which are available. For example, for reasons I don't fully understand, the Human Resources Ministry has its own numbers and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, we have a picture which is emerging. And what troubles me very much are two things which are sort of related. We have, over the years, the Malaysian population is supposed to be 33 million or so. And we have a labor force size of about 15 million. And of which 2 million are supposed to be foreigners. Now, a few years ago, when Richard Rayot was the Human Resources Minister, he announced a figure of 6.7 million foreign workers in this country. Okay, if you take out the 2.2 million or so who are documented, who are legally here, we have about 4.5 million at that time. We're talking about some years ago, 4.5 million who are undocumented. Now, what we have seen in the last few weeks in Malaysia is very troubling for me. We have seen, complete reversal of sympathy for the Rohingya. And what we have seen is, anti-Rohingya sentiment, which has been fanned by various quarters for various reasons, which I don't fully understand. And this has quickly turned in the last week or so against foreign workers. And what we have seen as far as foreign workers are concerned is, 2 or 3 days ago, it was reported that over 150 foreign workers who had been detained had disappeared. Where are they likely to go? They're going to go back to their cramped housing. If they had been detained because they were infected, just imagine the kind of spread of the infections which we are going to see in cramped housing situations. Many of the workers, for example, so-called Nepali security guards, many of them sleep by shifts. They have one bed, one person sleeps the day shift, the other person sleeps there during the night shift. They take turns. Those are the kinds of... Now look at what happened in Singapore. Singapore, there are very, very few illegal foreign workers. They're all legal because of the very nature of controls which they have in Singapore. Even then, foreign workers were reluctant to come forward if they were infected. They were very reluctant because they feared that they would be thrown out, etc., etc. So what we have seen, the so-called second spike in Singapore, has been largely due to foreign workers. Okay, more than 80% foreign workers. And the one other area were the old age homes, where most of the dirty jobs, cleaning up after the old people and so on and so forth, was being done by foreign workers. Okay, so you see the interaction between the spike and the presence of foreign workers. Now, we have a worse situation because 4 to 5 million probably undocumented workers are even more afraid of coming forward. And somebody misspoke and said that they will have to pay. Nobody is going to come forward. Now that is actually against MOH policy. MOH policy provides basic medical treatment to everybody. We do have some modicum of universal health care. Now, what happens in that situation? Nobody is going to come forward, and when they happen to get caught or arrested, they are going to escape if they can. Now, a few of us have recommended that we have an amnesty and a promise of free testing and treatment. There is nothing less will induce them to come forward. If we are going to cope with COVID-19, we cannot allow that there will be no other solution. We need to deal with them. And so this kind of anti-Rohingya and now anti-foreign worker sentiment is not going to help. It's not going to be to help. The fact that we have become so reliant on foreign workers is a problem which we have inherited because of policies of past politicians, undoubtedly. But now, threatening them and all these kinds of things is simply not going to help. So we need to be very pragmatic and make a number of very bold measures to get them to come forward if they suspect that they're infected. And I can't think of any other incentives rather than an amnesty and giving them a 1-year work permit, for instance, after when they come forward. So this will, of course, politicians who have been getting contracts to import workers and so on and so forth, those guys are not going to be very happy with this. Okay? But this is precisely what needs to be. Otherwise we are not going to be able to deal with COVID-19. So here again, we see how all these different ministries are actually directly involved. What do we advise those people operating buses? What do we advise for other arrangements where people have to have no choice but to congregate? All these arrangements, all these are not easy problems. The city of Seoul is about 4 or 5 times the size of Kuala Lumpur, in terms of population. But they managed to address these problems without a lockdown. We need to begin to think about how do we address these problems, and the only way we can address these problems if the people get involved, if the people feel they have a say, if the people can say that these are the problems they face and they can come up with solutions. Their solutions might not be the best, but that if you don't get any feedback, you're going to continue to make the same old problems where the rich and powerful are the ones who are dictating policy, which is the situation which got us into the mess in the first place.
On that note of your last comment just now, mainly on the question about the effect of the COVID-19 and economic condition towards the more vulnerable and the working groups. I'm looking toward the next question posed by Tan Chi Kyong. Instead of on the working classes, it addresses more towards the rich and the powerful. So I'm just going to read this question. Since the last few decades, if not centuries, capitalism and democracy have both been manipulated for the benefits of the rich and powerful. What is the economic and political impact of COVID-19 to the rich and powerful? Would capitalism and democracy continue to be used by the rich, or would perhaps the system show some kind of collapse or some kind of other types of effects?
Well, I think it's very difficult to make generalizations about all rich and powerful people, but I think one has to recognize, many. I've been giving a lot of similar talks, but mainly to people overseas. Okay, and last week, for example, I gave 3 lectures in different countries to different audiences in Africa. And one question which came up is, how come there's so little COVID-19 in Africa, especially in the poorer countries? And I have a hypothesis. Okay, I have no evidence. Please don't claim. Please don't say that I have no evidence for this. But I suspect that the principal means of spreading COVID-19 has been passenger air travel. Okay, so it is human beings who have taken COVID-19 around the world. And there is some anecdotal and other suggestions that this is the case. And part of the reason why the situation is not worse in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the poorer countries, is because they have very few visitors. You know, and they certainly do not have the international jet set moving between these societies. The international jet set is very present in certain places. And but thanks to strong preventive measures, for example, in Bangkok, okay, they have been able to limit the infection rate in Bangkok. Okay? Bangkok is a much more significant air travel hub. Okay? If you think about the early infections in Europe being taken from places like Singapore, you know, all facilitated by international air travel. So this is a very crude hunch I have, okay? As I said, I don't have any reason for thinking so. I mean, no proof for this claim. But I think that basically also implies that the rich and powerful have often been the ones. And very often they have been the ones who have been most irresponsible. Let me give you an example, a very sad example from what has happened in Brazil. Most people don't follow what has happened in Brazil. But in Brazil, you have a president, Jair Bolsonaro, who has, I wrote an article once saying he has out-trumped Trump. Okay? Because Trump, you know how Trump has behaved, right? Trevor Noah and others remind us all the time what Trump has been doing in the US. But in the US, and especially this year because he needs to get re-elected, he has to be seen to be responding to what is clearly a major public health crisis in the US. But Bolsonaro doesn't have such constraints. Okay? But incredibly, about 2 weeks ago, he joined a demonstration in front of army headquarters and called for the army to stage a coup. Now you might think this is a crazy guy. No, but there's a method to this apparent madness. And what Bolsonaro was basically doing is that with a coup, he expects to remain as president, but he will have central authority. He will have greater authority. Right now, President Bolsonaro is fighting with the state governors. Okay? Because the state governors have a different view about how to handle the situation. Okay? And Bolsonaro is insisting that he's the only one who knows and he's the only one who must decide. So he wants a coup, apparently against his own government, actually to strengthen his own powers. Okay? Which, as you can imagine, President Trump would also like. Okay? To strengthen his own powers. He's very angry with many of the governors and all that, and others. So you think about analogous situations. You know, if you have much more open government, much more consultative government, where all the ministries are involved, all the state governments are involved, you know, in making decisions, you wouldn't have the kinds of problems which we have in this country, where, you know, the left leg doesn't seem to be moving in synchrony with the right leg, and so on and so forth. So we really need an all-of-government approach, a whole-of-society approach, not only in Malaysia, but throughout the world. And the only way to do that is by uniting the country. We take the other example in Argentina. This new president of Argentina, Fernandez, came in December. Okay, and when he declared a state of the first public health emergency in the whole of Latin America in March, he basically is within his constitutional rights. He declared the public health emergency, but he consulted everybody. He consulted all the governors. He consulted all the opposition parties. And when he declared the public health emergency, he didn't take sole credit for it. He brought the entire all the leaders of all the political parties together, and together it was announced. Okay, so similarly, later on when he said he wants to restructure the debt, because the debt in Argentina is a huge problem, as many people know, what he did again was to have all the political parties, including the political parties which were responsible for the debt growing, together to have a strong sense of national unity, to convey that sense and to demonstrate not only to the country but to the world that they are united in terms of wanting to adopt debt problems. So this crisis, as the Chinese character for crisis says, you have danger, huge danger, but you also have an opportunity. And it's very, very important to recognize the opportunities which come along. But the opportunities will only come along if we begin to recognize the almost unique character of the crisis and its implications.
Thank you, Prof. I'll go to a next question. In fact, several questions participants posed the questions which is relates to using more the new technology, mainly to say the Industrial Revolution 4.0 as an approach towards engaging with the situation of the economy of the current time. So this question, give an example, are we as a nation should focus on agriculture or food, or instead of technology or Industrial Revolution 4.0, as if there's a comparison whether utilizing the technology now would perhaps be a better way when it comes to looking for future or in our current economic model at that time, of this time. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, I have to confess that even before COVID-19, I was always skeptical about this Industrial Revolution 4.0 and 3.0 and so on. These are all inventions of the rich and powerful sitting in Davos, you know, and frankly, they don't really shed much light. Let's not forget that in many ways, we haven't even completed the digital revolution 3.0, okay? So what is supposed to be novel about 4.0? Artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence has been with us since at least the 80s, if not earlier, okay? At least machine learning. So neural networks are perhaps the new neural learning is probably, deep learning is probably new, and they are related to neural networks, and that is probably significantly new. But let's not forget that a lot of this is labor displacing. It is this part of it, especially artificial intelligence, is going to displace labor. Most of it is not labor enhancing. It is labor displacing. So how it helps us, I'm not so sure. I would pose the question to those who question. I'm sure they have ideas and they can convince us otherwise. Now, the other aspect, of course, is the new biotechnologies, a new generation of biotechnology, which is extremely important. And there again, I would like I'm much more open. I do think that many of the new possibilities raised by recent developments in biotechnology are extremely important for us to begin to consider. But in many ways, what this crisis is a reflection of the failure of biotechnology. The failure of biotechnology to sufficiently anticipate these problems. Let's not forget that the previous 3 presidents of the United States have all been warning about global pandemics. Clinton, Bush, and Obama have been talking about these kinds of catastrophic scenarios. Although I don't care for him very much, Bill Gates has been funding a lot of efforts to think very, very seriously about pandemics and so on. Now, of course, there are worse scenarios. Just imagine something which is a virus which is completely airborne. Right now, it is aerosol-borne. Okay, if you have a completely airborne virus, we are really going to be in much, much more serious trouble than we are in right now. Of course, the characteristics and the infectiousness and the mortality rates associated with such a virus may be different. We don't know. Okay, but I think there are even worse possible scenarios. But let's not preoccupy ourselves with that. The fact is that with all these advances, okay, we have been able to accelerate some of the things. I mean, if you think about what the Chinese did with the genome sequencing, you know, being available less than 2 weeks after the infection was reported, not even the death, after the first infections were reported. It is amazing. And it was probably enhanced by the use of AI. It was probably enhanced by the use of some of the new biotechnologies. But, and I do believe that both AI, big data, and biotechnologies, the new biotechnologies are being used to develop, to expedite the availability of both cures as well as the vaccine. Okay, and all this are very, very helpful. But I think we have to recognize the difference between means and ends. Okay, what the unfortunate discussion and why I was very uninterested in all this hype about IR4 is that a lot of it was confusing the means with the ends. This new technology are basically means. Okay, they can enable human life to be more, you know, enhance human life in many, many important and useful ways. But they need to be deployed to those ends. And who decides on how these things are deployed? Again, the rich and powerful, and usually to make even more money for themselves. Not the scientists. The scientists are usually very, very altruistic when they're doing their science. But their masters are not very different from the masters of the vast majority of us in the world. And so the priorities are different. So we need to begin to think about the deployment of those technologies, you know, to ends which ensure human progress and enhance human well-being. And that's what we should be doing. So I don't want to be, I think just posing IR4 as a solution in and of itself doesn't appeal to me. But if you tell me that there are ways in which IR4 can be used to address many of the problems which we were talking about earlier, then I would very much like to engage with the several people you said are very interested in those possibilities.
And another key theme questions that have been raised by participants, of course, is regards to the role of the government and the response by the government. One in particular I'm selecting here is talking about the government's economic stimulus package. So I'm reading this through. Now, every countries, their governments provide large economic stimulus package and indirectly increase the country debts. How are all these countries going to pay off the debts due to COVID-19 in the future? But that one may perhaps be something which is more global. But if you look into the situation in Malaysia now and how the government is, as you mentioned, producing reliefs, and perhaps later in the coming months, could there be any new stimulus packages that would be introduced, and how would it be best to manage such stimulus for the benefit of the people in this kind of state?
I think firstly, it is incorrect to call the Prihatin package a stimulus package. It is a Prihatin package. It is a relief package. Okay, where the new regime is trying to demonstrate its concern for the plight of the population due to the measures which were introduced, particularly the MCO, the lockdown. Okay, it is a relief package. How can one call it a stimulus package? Okay? Yes, it sustains buying, but that is not the stimulus which is needed. What I think is needed, and I'm not criticizing the government for this, because that the relief package is what was desperately needed when it was announced. And frankly, I take the view that we need not have had the lockdown, but of course, there were many circumstances, including the politics of a takeover of the government and so on and so forth, which I don't want to get into right now. What you did have is a relief package, and the MCO might well have been needed because of the 3 weeks which were lost due to the transition in government. Okay, and so you don't, 3 weeks can be a very long time. If you look at the projections of what would have happened in China if you didn't have the measures which were undertaken after Wuhan, they are terrifying. And so when we think about that at a very, very much smaller scale in Malaysia, because the virus spread seems to be almost exponential, it may well have necessitated a lockdown. But these are all hypothetical questions, which we cannot really understand, cannot really answer authoritatively at this moment. And the fact is that we've had an MCO for almost more than 1.5 months now, almost 2 months. Now, the question then is, what measures will be needed to restart the economy? And that, I think, is also important. For example, if you've been forced to pay rent, and you have absolutely no income for almost 2 months, what do? We need some common guidelines by which debt relief and other kinds of things are extended to the population at large. And the leadership has to come from the government, and in this case, perhaps Bank Negara, to try to deal with something. Using the interest rate alone is tying the hands of the government unnecessarily. Frankly, I'm not as obsessed as some of our friends are about the fact that the debt is growing. These are extraordinary times. I don't think Roosevelt fought World War II thinking about how much the debt was growing. You don't start talking about things like that. You should be raising questions about the debt growing for unnecessary things, okay? Such as the size of the civil service doubled during the Najib administration, for instance, and so on and so forth. But when you think about it very carefully, the debt itself is not a problem, especially for Malaysia. Other countries are in much more vulnerable situation, Argentina being one case, but there are other countries in far worse cases. The amount of debt which the Japanese government has, for example, is more than 200% annual GDP. But nobody says Japan is in serious trouble because of that. So let's put these things in perspective. Okay? So I wouldn't be worried about the debt, but I do think that the design of packages to restart the economy, for instance, because now we've had Prihatin, and perhaps a significant extension of the Prihatin is necessary because of the Prihatin was announced with a lockdown of 2 weeks in mind, or at least that was the claim. Now we have a situation where the lockdown has been 7 weeks. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? And for Muslims to come back to during if you're involved in the food business, if you have a small stall selling food to Muslims, what business are you going to be able to do for the rest of Ramadan? Mm-hmm. So very practical problems which need to be rethought. So you need to ease and enable as much of the viable enterprises to go back in, okay? And I would say, as I said earlier, you've seen, for example, Ethiopian Airlines. What are they doing? They realize that there's not going to be much business they don't have much passenger business. They have basically reconfigured their aircraft. They're doing almost not entirely, but a lot of the aircraft are now doing cargo. And they're very successfully deployed. Ethiopian Airlines has been able to survive for many, many decades. It was the only airline, only major airline in the whole of Africa for decades and decades. So they were able to adjust quickly to this situation. What are we doing? Okay. I still remember when I was a student, once traveling on a plane, Czech Airlines at that time, and the first part of the plane was the passengers, and behind we could smell, because the plane stopped in, I think, Mumbai, and picked up a lot of Alfonso mangoes. So the Alfonso mangoes were already almost ripe, and so we had this wonderful smell of Alfonso mangoes during the rest of the flight, all the way to Prague. Okay? We were poor students. We took whatever the cheapest airline available, and Czech Airlines happened to be the way to do it. Now, the point is that you can configure airlines very, very differently. The likelihood of mass budget air travel in the near future is probably relatively low. So people have to think very seriously about, this is not a business as usual scenario. It's not going to be a business as usual scenario, not for 1 month or 2 months or MCO. It's going to be for quite a long time to come. Okay? And perhaps we will never go back to the old way of doing things. So I think we need to get people to, but these decisions have to be made, these hard-nosed decisions have to be made. You cannot have who is the billionaire with the ear of the minister or the ministers. We can't have that kind of a situation. That's not how policies should be made. Policies should be made on a very hard-nosed, realistic assessment of the economy. And we should be doing that on the basis of our understanding of the data which is available from the Department of Statistics and other sources in Malaysia, not on the basis of some kind of supposed best practices which we import from, via an international financial institution and so on. What do they know about the concrete problems of Malaysia? Whether it is from Manila or from Washington, they don't know. Okay, it is we who should know, and if we don't know, we are in real trouble. Okay, because what those people know, they know because of us. Okay, because our Department of Statistics and others are providing that kind of information. So it is very, very important that we know ourselves and stop depending on so-called international best practices, to guide us. We need to know ourselves, know our economies, and have an open discussion. Right after the crisis started, I called for a government of national unity. Of course, everybody didn't like it, right? People on both sides of Parliament didn't like it. But this is one of those challenges, when you really need to unite the nation to do what Fernandez did in Argentina and so on and so forth. These are exceptional times in life, So I'm very keen on seeing how we can move forward as a nation, It is true that the circumstances under which this government came in, but I do think that the Prime Minister is trying to do his best. I'm not so sure he's been well served by all the ministers he has. Many of them are there for all kinds of reasons. And he's, of course, constantly looking over his shoulder at what is going to happen in terms of the survival of his own government. But I think we really need to, we cannot just go back to business as usual or politics as usual. We really need to rise above the mess which we have inherited.
Thank you, Prof. I think I'll I'll just get into the last round of questions. You mentioned about looking into alternative models, including models coming from other countries. This one question by Lakshmi Lavanyarama points out specifically on the model which is called the donut model by Kat Raworth, being adopted by the city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, in which focuses on a specific group which is requiring the basic important needs of economic support. Do you have any particular comments on this model, the donut model as they call it, at the city of Amsterdam?
Well, I have to confess that I'm very much against donuts. I dislike donuts. They are not. They're basically very high carbs and high sugar foods. Okay, but that's not why I don't. I know the intent of the donut model, and there are some very important messages implied. But frankly, I'm not sure what relevance it has for the current situation which we face. Okay? The current situation which we face is a problem where you need to move away from the hierarchies and the pyramids which Kat and her co-donut model sponsors are promoting. But let's not have any illusions about what Amsterdam is like. Okay, Amsterdam is still a society of rich and poor, except that the poor have more rights. The squatters have rights, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's the basic difference. But let us not forget for one moment that Dutch society, including Amsterdam society, is a society which was built on wealth acquired from the rest of the world. Okay? The Dutch East India Company was well ahead of the English East India Company in terms of what it did. And that Dutch East India Company, it's a very interesting model. I mean, because Holland at that time was a republic. There was no king. This monarchy is an invented monarchy from the last last century and a half or so. Okay, at that time there was a stadtholder. And the stadtholder is like almost like Caesar, right? But Caesar, if you think of the Roman Senate, in ancient Rome, the Roman Senate, and you had the leader, okay? But it wasn't an inherited position or anything like that. It later became an inherited position, but that's a recent invention. But the Dutch Republic, so you had, in that case, the rich people of the country coming together and forming the Dutch East India Company. And Dutch East India Company was primarily, as we know, not about India. Although it was called the East India Company, it was primarily about Indonesia, which is where they did have some concessions in South Asia initially, including in Sri Lanka. But later, most of the wealth came from our part of the world, from in what is now Indonesia. So it's very important for us to put this into perspective, So you can afford certain things precisely because of that. Now, this is not to detract from Dutch achievements. I mean, if you think, for example, when the Dutch got a lot of money in the 1950s from the discovery of natural gas, what did they do? They didn't build a lot of fancy buildings. They used the money to improve child nutrition. And that's why the Dutch today are much taller than most of the rest of us. Okay? Because they had improved nutrition right from the 1950s, thanks to how they used that. How did the country even begin? How was it built? It was built by reclaiming land from the sea and taking the salt out of the land by planting certain plants and so on and so forth. The Dutch ingenuity is not something I want to trivialize for one moment. And today, Holland, with 1/6 of the size of the UK, 1/6 of the size of the UK, is the second largest agricultural exporter in the world after the US. Okay? That is a tremendous achievement. Okay, and there's much you can learn. Wageningen University is probably doing the most advanced research in life sciences and particularly in agricultural sciences. You know, and this is something which we can all learn on, instead of being embarrassed about having a university which is called the Agricultural University, which is what happened in this country. Most of you are too young to remember this, but until about 30 years ago, there was a university called Agricultural University, and now it's called Putra University. Now, you know, and so there has been a systematic downgrading of the importance of agriculture in our society. So there is much for us to correct, you know, in terms of our valuation of how we perceive the world and so on. But one important thing is a recognition of the need to learn from, not only from ourselves, to know ourselves better and to learn from ourselves, but also to learn from others. And we do not have enough, you know, our learning is always usually to the West, you know, mainly to the UK, and then increasingly now to the US. And in this particular example, we are hearing about Amsterdam. But you know, why is it that we don't have much to learn from Vietnam, from Kerala, from Argentina, from Korea? You know, these are all things which are far, far more relevant in terms of teaching us how we could better deal with the present situation. Okay? And so, you know, in a way, it's a retrospective way of justifying my weekly columns. You know, I've spent the last 2 months writing on nothing but COVID-19, but you know, it's also why I take a particular slant. I'm not so interested in Trump's you know, thing. I mean, it's very funny, and if it wasn't so tragic, it would be very funny, you know. But you know, but we have a world to live with. We have a lot of people who are suffering. Some people would say suffering unnecessarily, and now we have to try to build a better world from the ashes, from the ruins, as the late Burhanuddin Al-Helmi once said, you know, di atas robohan kota Melaka kita dirikan, you know, etc., etc. So we have to rebuild, you know, a better society on the ruins of COVID-19, and we have to learn quickly. We have to learn, and we have to learn from our own history, our own experiences, and learn from others as well. The world has much to teach us. The world has much to teach us. History has much to teach us. And, you know, I mean, how many, for example, take a simple thing like the quarantine. Where does the word quarantine comes from? It comes from quarantina, okay, which was the requirement of the authorities in Venice, you know, when ships came during the time of the plagues of the 15th century, 14th century, 15th century. And the word quarantina came from al-arba'iyah, from the word 40, which was what, as Khaldun reminds us, was what was practiced in Istanbul and elsewhere, you know, requiring ships which might be bringing some sickness to be quarantined in the first place. So we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn from the world, and I do agree with Lakshmi that we have a lot to learn about the donut economy. But just like with Industrial Revolution 4, you know, I think to think that that IR4 is going to be our savior, or that the donut economy is going to be our savior. To deal with a particular problem, you first need to know the nature of the problem. Then you come up with the solutions. And yes, by all means, learn from all these things. But let's address the problem.
Thank you very much. On that note, with some elements of optimism, I would like to thank Prof. Jomo again for speaking and sharing important ideas and important thoughts. We'd like to thank all our participants and our attendees in our webinar again. I have to apologize that I didn't have the opportunity to address all the questions which is being shared. I hope from time to time we will have the opportunity to touch into these questions in perhaps in future sessions and discussions. Before I end the session today, I would like to once again thanks Prof. Jomo. I would like to call to our attendees to come up with like a virtual round of applause. And for the interesting points and discussions. Just to add that next week is IRF, we are going to have another webinar session which we will touch, which covers something which related to the post-COVID-19 and how does it relate to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we will have also speakers that will be sharing regarding that topic. Thank you very much again. Thank you very much again, Prof. Jomo.
Thank you very much, and thank you to your colleagues who have helped out.
Yes,
thank
sure.
you to all those who are still listening after a fairly long session.
Yes,
some friends from Peru.
Yeah, there's some from different countries as well. Hope to see you all again. And for those who are fasting, I would like to wish selamat berbuka puasa in a few hours time, and selamat bulan Ramadan as well. Okay, assalamualaikum, and see you all again.
Thank you.